This is a story about fighting for justice, loss, and restoration. It's about how even in the darkest times, the light of hope can shine through the clouds of betrayal. Follow the hero on his journey to triumph over evil and the revival of the spirit. I still can't understand why some people are so confident in themselves. They think they can do whatever they want. A good friend of mine said that such people are idiots, and that they'll pay for their sins one day. I agreed with this, but I thought the process of reckoning from my abuser would happen sooner. If only I hadn't forgotten my jacket at home, things might have turned out differently. In a completely different scenario, my 18-wheeler was loaded and ready to embark on its 600-meter delivery. But my jacket remained hanging in my wardrobe at home. The supervisor wasn't pleased, but he granted me a few extra minutes to swing by and retrieve it, muttering curses as the trailer wheels grazed the curb while navigating. As I turned into my narrow street, I saw my boss's car parked in my driveway with the engine running. I thought, oh no. I hurried through the front door and down the hallway to the bedroom I shared with my wife. I opened the door and saw. The room was flooded with light, revealing my wife and boss in a compromising position. She was on all fours, unaware of my presence, while he noticed me immediately. His expression briefly flickered with guilt before he resumed his actions with a grin, his hands trembling. I retrieved my forgotten jacket from I was really angry. I shouted at them, "We'll talk later," before storming out and slamming both the bedroom and front door. I made my way to the cab of the Kenworth truck as I drove through the suburban streets and onto the freeway. Despite the turmoil, I managed to regain control. I was lost in thought, doubts about returning home nibbling away at me, when the truck hit a bump and veered off the road towards a looming tree trunk. That's the last thing I remember. "I believe he's regaining consciousness," said a distant female voice. I struggled fruitlessly to open my eyes, but my lens remained immobile and I couldn't feel my legs. Another voice, which I knew was my wife Diane, said, "Thank heavens." More voices joined in and I felt hands touching my face. "Good morning, Mr. Hammond. It's good to see you awake again. How are you feeling?" I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't move. I opened my eyes and saw that the room was brightly lit. I could see a few people moving around, but I couldn't make out who they were. "Mr. Hammond," the male voice said. "Blink if you can hear me." I blinked. "Excellent," the voice said. "You've been in an accident and are currently in hospital. Please don't move. You sustained multiple fractures, so we've kept you in an induced coma for 14 days while we stabilize you. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand." I blinked once more. "Very well, now we need to focus. Your recovery will take time, but we'll get you back on your feet." I was tired and drowsy, so I closed my eyes and slipped into a dream. When I opened them again, it was unclear how much time had passed. My vision cleared and I noticed various tubes connected to me. I turned my head slightly and saw my wife sitting in a chair in the corner reading a book. She stopped reading and came to my bedside. "Steve, I'm relieved to see you awake. I was really worried we'd lost you. How are you feeling?" I found the question a bit strange after weeks in a coma. How could I possibly explain my state before I could respond? However, I discovered I still couldn't speak. She gently touched my forehead before returning to her seat. Her expression a mix of emotions. I couldn't tell whether she was feeling compassion, anger, sympathy, or guilt. I held her gaze until she looked away, which confirmed my suspicion that she felt guilty. I struggled to make sense of my thoughts and memories of the accident that had taken place. Why had I left the house in such a hurry? The effort had proved overwhelming and I had succumbed to unconsciousness. Once more, I'm sure it was the medication that was making it easier for me to cope when I next awoke. The room was in darkness and the chair had been replaced by a makeshift cot. Diane was asleep, covered by a thin hospital blanket. As my thoughts wandered, they gradually came together. I was flooded with memories as I picked up my truck. From the depot, I realized my jacket was still at home. I burst into my bedroom to find my wife with my company boss. Everything began to make sense. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I wanted to shout, but I could only manage a sound. It was enough to wake Diane, who hurried to my side from her cut. I winced as she reached for my face, trying to turn away. I hope my eyes showed the rage I'd been feeling for days. I was on heavy medication to manage the pain as well as a broken back. My truck was totaled, but luckily, a trailing car had reported it right away. The ambulance arrived quickly and the doctor started explaining what had happened and what I needed to do to recover. Throughout all this, my wife Diane was there in my room. I could speak again, but I didn't know what to say to her. One of the nurses noticed and asked me what was going on. When Diane went to the bathroom, she said she'd never seen a more devoted wife. Diane had been by my side since shortly after I was admitted, refusing to leave. I decided not to disappoint her when Diane returned and the nurse had left. I wanted to find out more. How long had it been? Diane, she turned to me and said, "They think you fell asleep at the wheel." She added, "That's not what I'm asking," I replied. "I know you didn't fall asleep at the wheel, but something caused my truck to swerve off the road. What about you and my boss? How long have you been having an affair behind my back?" "Steve, I really don't want to discuss him right now. I love you and only you, and I'm fully dedicated to helping you recuperate from this terrible accident. You may think I'm being ungrateful for saying so, but the last time I saw the two of you didn't seem that into me. I also think this wasn't the first time you two were together." She didn't need to respond. She looked guilty as hell, avoiding my gaze. "So Diane, how long?" "Steve, I really don't want to discuss it. Do you want a divorce?" "Oh God, no. Steve, please trust me when I say I love you and only you. I want to have your children. I want to grow old with you." "That seems unlikely now, Diane. You betrayed our wedding vows. Remember when we promised to be faithful to each other until death do us part? I'm sorry to disappoint you by surviving the crash, but it seems like you couldn't wait for me to die anyway. So the idea of us living together happily ever after seems pretty unlikely. Wouldn't you agree?" She recoiled from my harsh words and sank into her chair, crying softly, hands covering her face. "I think you should go home, Diane. I know I've been harsh on you, but I can't help but think of you as my boss, violating you whenever I see you." She cried louder, grabbed her overnight bag and stumbled out of my room into the hospital corridor. I was left alone feeling pretty wretched when a nurse she passed by and immediately noticed my wife's absence. I didn't respond but asked her to let my supervisor know I could receive visitors. Less than an hour later, he arrived. I saw the truck. "Steve, you're one lucky guy. I can't believe you made it out of there alive." "Thanks. Thanks for coming, Phil. I've been thinking about the accident for the past few days even though I don't remember it exactly. Something broke on that truck." Phil wasn't sure, but he agreed to speak with the workshop guy. We chatted about various topics until he finally addressed the "I thought maybe Diane was with you. Has she been around?" he asked, sounding a bit cautious. "She just left." "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason. Steve just assumed she'd be here, that's all." He shifted uncomfortably on his feet before making his excuses and leaving. It struck me that Diane's affair with the boss might. I think she might have been a bit naive about how things would play out. The next day, I was visited by two colleagues, George Lambert, the workshop foreman, and Jack McGregor, a Stern Scott Union rep. Neither of them seemed pleased. Mac took charge and said, "Steve, we've encountered an issue. I brought George along to explain, but your accident was inevitable. I've already initiated the process to inspect and clear every tractor in the entire fleet before its next operation. Management is furious because numerous deliveries will be delayed and some customers have already threatened to switch carriers if we fail them." He handed me a logbook from the workshop. "Steve, George gave me the workshop log for your tractor. I damaged it in the accident, so the last page is filled out. There's a note about a broken spring on the front axle. Turn back to the previous page. I've highlighted it." I turned the page and we discussed it. I also noticed uneven tire wear and found an almost identical note about a broken spring leaf. This was going back 3 weeks. I asked George why he didn't replace it. He said management wouldn't let him hold up the truck. He had a replacement in the workshop 2 weeks ago, but they refused to let him take the rig off the road because they were too busy. They kept saying it would be fixed at the next service. George explained, but nobody thought to tell me. I asked, "Sorry, Steve, but the boss was sure it was just a minor issue, so I didn't think about it until the accident." "I'm sorry, it's my fault you got hurt," George said, "but they knew the risk and took a chance with your life. I called our legal team today and they've assigned Tim Delaney to handle your case. He already has the law on your side. We need to look into book entries and statements from other drivers. This guy's a real fighter, Steve. We need to tackle this on 2 fronts, getting you compensated for medical bills, rehab and lost wages, and securing a package for the likelihood that you won't be able to drive professionally again due to your back injury." Max's words really shook me. I hadn't even considered the possibility of not returning to work. I lay back in bed, closing my eyes. "Steve, don't worry. Just focus on getting better and moving forward. We've got your back, Mac," he reassured me. Watching them leave my hospital room, a tear slipped down my cheek. I suppose feeling disheartened was justified in a matter of weeks. I had crashed my truck, been in a coma, and now faced the reality of losing not only my wife but also my job the next day. Tim Delaney entered my room with energy. He was an imposing presence, likely in his early 40s, standing well over 6 feet tall with a physique that suggested he could be a professional basketball player. We went over the crash, workshop reports, and then discussed future options. He was in his early 40s, stood well over 6 feet tall, and had a physique that suggested he could be a professional basketball player. We went over the crash workshop reports and then discussed future options. "You started 2 years of a business degree," he remarked. "What made you abandon that and switch to truck driving for a living?" I grinned. My father was a long-haul truck driver and often took me along during my school years, so it wasn't as it might seem like a big change. But there's another reason. I met a wonderful girl and we couldn't wait to get married. No, she wasn't pregnant. We were just deeply in love and changing careers, which allowed us to be together. It's a great story, Steve, but I've heard rumors that things might not be going well between you two. Am I the last person in the state to find out my wife was cheating with my boss? I've confirmed with Tim said. I look forward to tearing him apart in court. I don't really care about him anymore, but I need you to start preparing divorce papers as soon as possible. We don't typically handle divorces, but I'm willing to make an exception in this case. Tim was exceptional during our brief time together. I grew to trust him deeply. He exuded compassion, energy, and a strong sense of integrity that brought me hope. He gave me the lowdown on how he'd handle my legal action against my employers and told me I could get expert advice on my separation from Diane. For the first time since the accident, I felt a glimmer of optimism. I spent a few days getting over my injuries and had some medical tests, including CAT scans, to figure out how to treat my back. Then, an unexpected visitor showed up at he asked for ID, so I made sure to be extra careful. He gave me an envelope and asked me to sign it. I saw all the tubes attached to me, and he noticed too, so he left without saying anything. She handed me a letter from your company. It said you were being let go. I asked her to call Tim and read him the letter. He came to see me right away. He was angry about how you were treated. He said this letter will cost the company a lot. It basically means we don't have to argue in court about your ability to continue your chosen career. He took care of it. His cold and calculated treatment of an employee in the hospital recovering from a work-related injury won't earn him any favors either. What began as a typical day on the road to recovery shifted from hopelessness to optimism. Tim had a knack for instilling positivity about the future in me. Oh, and he added as he was leaving, your wife was served with divorce papers today. Diane hadn't visited since. She left in tears but came into my room just after dinner looking really angry. How could you do this to me? She cried. I don't want a divorce. I made a mistake, Steve. I made a mistake, but I love you, and I want us to stay together and work it out. I came into this confrontation much more prepared. Diane, your way of expressing love is a bit unusual. It was distressing enough to witness firsthand the damage you've done to our marriage, yet it seems I was the last to know what was going on. It's clear now that every time I went on a long trip, it was another meeting with my boss. I asked before about the extent of your affair, but you avoided the question. But it doesn't matter now, Diane. You've repeatedly disrespected me and our marriage vows. Have I ever denied you, Steve? Is that your defense? I asked incredulously. Honestly, Steve, I expected. How many times have you two been together since my accident? She averted her gaze and fell silent. I wondered if her silence meant they hadn't been together at all. Could there still be hope? We've had a solid marriage until now. I reminded her, let's not tarnish our good memories with anger and deceit. We'll have to discuss the division of assets eventually, but now isn't the time. Go home, Diane, if he brings you. I'm going to file for divorce and be with him, but I don't expect you to be my life partner anymore. I can't look at you without thinking about the moment I caught you with him. There's no way I can move past that. Goodbye, Diane. I wish you a happy life once more. She left my hospital room in tears this time. I hoped it was for the last time. Initially, my limbs recovered, and I was able to maneuver around the ward with plaster casts and undergo multiple therapies. I had to have surgery to fix my back injury. It was a complicated operation that lasted a few hours. I had to take painkillers for a long time after that. Tim Delaney was also in contact with the transport company. He wanted to sue them for damages. He was trying to find out if he could take them to court. He was looking at all the different ways he could take legal action. He had hoped to settle out of court. By the end of the trial, Tim had presented his case to a judge, and the witness testimonies were overwhelmingly in his favor. This undermined the company's defense. On the second day, the company's solicitors sought to settle out of court. Tim was aiming for maximum impact. As we entered the negotiation room, he said, they've lost and they know it now. They're just trying to. Tim said he'd limit the fallout, and he did. He demanded at least $10 million in damages and compensation. He also made sure to bring up my ongoing medical expenses, back pain, and the uncertainty of retraining for a new career. Even I found myself sympathizing with my own plight. The negotiation had to be wrapped up before the court reconvened at 11 a.m., which was good for us because the other side offered $5 million. Tim seemed happy with that, even though he knew we'd probably settle somewhere between his initial demand of $10 million and their offer. In the end, he got what he wanted by pushing them until both parties agreed on $5 million. I was really happy about that. It was the first time I'd seen my boss since the accident. I could see he was angry at being forced into the situation, and he couldn't even look me in the eye. I went to the depot one last time to say goodbye to my colleagues, George, who'd highlighted the company's negligence in his meticulous records, and Jock, who'd advocated tirelessly for my fair treatment. It was time for me to regroup and plan for the future. I decided to relocate to my parents' hometown where I'd previously studied and resume my education in hopes of securing an administrative position. I purchased a 2-bedroom apartment near the university and a small hatchback for transportation. I found a bedroom apartment near the university and a small hatchback for getting around. Going back to academia was an interesting experience. I was a decade older than most of my peers, but also much more motivated. Success became a genuine goal. My parents were happy with the new arrangement. I made a point of visiting them. Every weekend, I took Dad to football games or fishing in the bay, and we often ate out at restaurants. Although Diane hadn't signed the divorce papers, she was handling the mortgage and utilities, so I decided not to push the issue and avoid conflict in my life. Following Tim Delaney's advice, I let him get a security company to put up a few security cameras in our house until our divorce was finalized. He thought it was a good idea to keep an eye on the place without having to physically check in a couple of years later. I graduated with honors and went on to look for a stable long-term job, which led me to an accounting firm in the city center specializing in corporate bankruptcy management. They had a pretty innovative approach. Instead of immediately resorting to bankruptcy, they aimed to assess operations and try to restore profitability, which sometimes involved making sacrifices for creditors. I found this work really fulfilling as part of a small team of seasoned professionals. I conducted forensic examinations of various companies to identify shortcomings and worked with key personnel to come up with turnaround strategies. It didn't take long for my knack for spotting corporate weaknesses and coming up with effective solutions to get noticed. At the end of the year, my contributions were acknowledged by the partners and my colleagues, and I was given the chance to lead my own team, along with a nice pay rise. One morning, when a new task arrived at my desk, I was surprised to find that the company in financial distress was none other than my former employer. I had to think carefully about whether there might be a conflict of interest. I quickly called the senior partner and asked to be taken off the case. He said, "Steve, we know you used to work for this company, which makes you perfect for this job. You still have former colleagues who depend on this business, so you have an extra incentive to help them out of this situation. I also have faith in your professionalism." My first task was to tell my old boss that our firm. He went on about how unfair it all was, saying there was no real problem, just a minor cash flow issue that had already been fixed, and that our involvement would be a complete waste of time. I told him the courts had ordered us to get involved and that we'd be arriving with my team at 9. I called him at 9 the following morning to thank him in advance for his cooperation. When we arrived, it was clear that the staff had been told to give us as little information as possible, which made it difficult for us to get things done. This was not a surprise to management, as they had not managed their own business effectively during the morning. I spoke with Jack and George briefly after that. I had a chat with Jack and George over coffee after a group meeting with my team at lunchtime. I made up my mind, knocked on the boss's door, went in and said it might be easier if he left the building so my team could get on with their work. He said no, but when he realized I could ask him to leave by force, he agreed and left. It took me 2 days to figure out what the issue was. A young member of our team, a petite blonde with pigtails who looked no older than 16 and had just graduated from a commercial school, came to me with a ledger from a creditor. This driver is employed by the company and gets paid regularly for long-distance trips across the state. However, I've checked and can't find the same truck listed on any of the freight. So what exactly is it being used for and who is footing the bill? She asked, grateful for my sharp observation skills. Our request for copies of the invoices was met with a similar response. Phantom operators are a common tactic among transportation companies that use subcontracted vehicles. It's usually uncovered when a member of the accounting team neglects to take time off. However, this wasn't the case here. When I looked at the invoices, I saw that the boss had approved each one. I asked the admin manager if the company had given the boss a laptop. He said yes and told me that they'd bought 4 Dell laptops about a year ago. The boss has the best one. I can show you the invoice. If you'd like to see it, I made a mental note of the boss's computer's serial number. My next step was to contact the local sheriff for assistance. I need to retrieve a company device from a manager's house and I suspect he won't willingly surrender it. The laptop likely holds crucial information for our investigation into his company. I explained to the sheriff, who agreed to pick me up from the depot office in 15 minutes. He picked me up from the depot office in 15 minutes during our drive. He started asking me questions. He said, "You used to work for this organization, right?" I said, "Yes, I do." He asked, "Do you remember that nasty accident?" I had to handle the wreckage recovery. "You were lucky to make it out alive." I said, "Yes, indeed, but things tend to work out in the end." He asked, "Did you leave your wife when you moved out?" I said, "That's correct." He asked if I was still involved with her. I told him I wouldn't know. I filed for divorce when I left, but it's not finalized yet. I don't have any romantic attachments at the moment and I don't care who she's with. I explained that I think she spends her nights alone. He visits during the day. He's married with kids and goes home every night. His wife probably doesn't know what's going on." The sheriff said, "Well, that makes two." I had no idea either until I caught them in the act on the day of the accident. We'd agreed that the sheriff would let me request the laptop and get involved only if necessary. He tried to pass off an older, different model, but I had the make and serial number of the one we were looking for, and the sheriff was coming over. From the squad car, he handed it over reluctantly, assuring me it would be returned to him within 24 hours. I figured he might be right, so I asked the sheriff to drop me back at the office. I gathered my team there and told one member to download the whole laptop contents onto our security server. That way, we could comply with any court order for its return, while also maintaining there was a hidden auto WD function to monitor any subsequent activity as expected. A young lawyer, likely new to the profession, arrived to demand the laptop's immediate return. We initially argued that the laptop belonged to the company, not his client, but ultimately conceded that he had the authority to take possession. The laptop had been carefully returned to its case before the lawyer's arrival, giving the impression that it hadn't been. The lawyer, who'd been waiting for this moment, took the laptop and skipped back to his car. Meanwhile, my IT team was examining the contents downloaded from the laptop. They had an easy time of it, as there weren't many passwords, and they could access everything. We focused on the bank records and found a series of transactions spanning several years, which had gradually increased in amount and frequency. It was clear that our target was moving a lot of money through fake invoices that got through because he approved them. So, our next step was to track the money. The first payments went to a bank account that was set up to look like it was for a contractor, but it was really controlled by the company's boss. The account only had a small balance, which made it look like we found out that the money was being sent to other places to avoid being caught by reading the codes from the downloaded files. We found some of the accounts where the money was hidden. These accounts were in different countries with different names. It was time to get Tim Delaney involved. He was the lawyer who helped me with my compensation case. He was still with the same firm and had become a partner. Since we last met, he seemed happy to see me and was keen to take legal action against my former boss. After days of meetings with the police and other authorities, we decided that the police should press charges of embezzlement and seek immediate incarceration without bail to prevent the defendant from fleeing the country. On the day James Seward was arrested, I got a visitor at the transportation company office. "Steve, there's a Mrs. Seward waiting for you at the reception desk." The young receptionist said, "All right, send her in." I thought this would be an interesting meeting. The woman who came in was actually the boss's assistant, who I'd taken over in his absence. She was blonde, she was built well, dressed impeccably, and exuded elegance. She extended her hand for a handshake and sat gracefully in a visitor's chair opposite my desk. After a surprisingly firm grip, "Mr. Hammond, I am James Seward, your husband." "Yes, I had gathered as much. How may I assist you, Mrs. Seward?" "I am aware that you played a role in my husband's imprisonment." "I don't think that's quite right, Mrs. Seward. We have evidence that your husband took money from his own company without authorization, which could have jeopardized its future. He's been detained pending trial, so it's his actions that have led to his imprisonment, not mine. Mr. Hammond, I just wanted to check what you know about the company's ownership. As I understand it, there are 2 shares held by you and your husband, but you're already aware of this. Why do you ask? I think if I mentioned my maiden name, you'd recognize my family. We were early investors in this company and have financed its growth primarily through loans secured by my family. As you mentioned, there are 2 shares, but the company's funding has come from my family. If the company fails, my husband stands to lose 1 share that was initially given to him. He demonstrated competence in managing the company during its early stages, and I still have faith in his abilities. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Upon our initial examination of the company's structure, we noted a significant number of loans originating from a single investor. But we hadn't yet linked this to Seward's wife, Mrs. Seward. Without intending any disrespect to your husband, our investigation suggests that he hasn't been entirely honest with you. This will be taken into account by the court in the upcoming weeks. We've already taken legal action to prevent him from accessing any part of the company's affairs. Additionally, we've reassured the staff that the organization is likely to trade its way out of its financial difficulties. Our findings indicate that it should be operating profitably in its current precarious state. This is the result of some dodgy activities, but I can't go into details. What I can tell you is that we won't leave until we're confident about securing the company's future, or if necessary, liquidating its assets. The refined lady, Rose, thanked me and left the office, leaving a hint of, by the time the court convened, we had all the evidence we needed. We not only understood how Seward had moved funds using a fictitious contractor, but also precisely where and when those funds were transferred. His motives remained a mystery, as none of it turned out that the embezzled funds had been spent in the courtroom. Our lawyer, Tim Delaney, systematically dismantled Seward's defense. Initially, Seward attempted to evade direct questions, evidently unaware of the extent of our gathered information. What he didn't know was that Tim Delaney had security cameras in place. He hadn't mentioned this detail since it was installed. When Seward was brought back to the witness stand, he had trouble answering a lot of financial questions. Delaney suddenly changed the subject. "Are you acquainted with a Mrs. Diane Hammond?" "Yes," he replied, visibly pale. "Could you please elaborate on your relationship with Mrs. Hammond?" "Sure. She's the sister-in-law of one of my former drivers. We'd sometimes meet at company events. Is there anything else you want to tell us about your relationship with Mrs. Hammond?" "Well, I don't have a personal relationship with her. As I said, she's the sister-in-law of a former employee who's currently investigating my company." "Have you ever had sex with Mrs. Hammond?" Delaney asked. "Your Honor, I'd like to release this witness for a potential recall later and call Mr. Brian Smith to the stand." "I've got permission to do so." A burly guy, about 40 years old and carrying a bit more weight than is advisable, casually approached the witness stand and was duly sworn in. "Mr. Smith, could you please state your full name and occupation for the court?" "Brian James Smith. I work as a security consultant with ABC Security." "Could you please inform the court of the task I assigned you on April 19th, 2 years ago?" "I was tasked with installing 5 security cameras. I'd like to ask Mr. and Mrs. Steve Hammond if their cameras are still working." "Mr. Smith?" "Yes, sir. Their footage is automatically transferred to our servers every 24 hours. It seems likely that this is the location where the photo was taken. The man in the photo is definitely James Seward, but I don't know the woman. She's sitting in the gallery," he mentioned. "Could you tell the court what the people in the photo were doing?" "Well, they were having sex." "Sexual intercourse, yes, sir. I have 4 more photos taken at different times over recent weeks from the security cameras in the house, which I'd like to submit as evidence. I'd like to present an affidavit from Mr. Smith, confirming the photos and the placement of the cameras, Your Honor. I'd also like to request that Mr. Seward be